On October 23, 2025, June Lockhart, the last surviving adult star of Lost in Space, passed away at the age of 100. Before her passing, she revealed secrets in her final interviews that the network had always wanted to keep hidden. Welcome to Star Radar, where we delve into the hidden histories of iconic television. Today, we're going inside the Jupiter 2 to unearth every secret buried for 6 decades. The cast members carried these stories their whole lives, and now, finally, every single one can be told. There's a unique freedom that comes with outliving nearly everyone you've worked with, a point where you stop protecting a story. When the cameras roll for what might be the last time, you speak the unvarnished truth. This is precisely what happened in the final years of the Lost in Space cast. By 2025, only 3 members of the original Robinson family were still alive. Bill Mumy, who played the boy genius Will Robinson from age 10 to 14, turned 72. Angela Cartwright, his television sister Penny, turned 73. Marta Kristen, the eldest daughter Judy, reached 81. And before June Lockhart, the family matriarch, died peacefully in Santa Monica on October 23, 2025, she had already been speaking more freely than at any point in the previous 6 decades. In her final interviews, Lockhart described what it actually felt like to learn that Lost in Space had been canceled. She did not receive a phone call, nor did she sit with a producer who thanked her for 3 years of work. Instead, she read it in a small notice in the entertainment section of her morning newspaper. That was the entirety of the farewell CBS offered to the cast of one of the most-watched science fiction shows in American television history. Lockhart was not the only one who carried that wound. Bill Mumy, who was 14 years old when the show ended, told interviewers decades later that he cried when his agent called him with the news. He described filming the last season with the complete belief that a 4th season was already arranged. Then the renewal list appeared, and the Jupiter 2 was not on it. He went home and wept, a 14-year-old boy ending a chapter that had consumed his entire childhood, learning it was over from someone who had to deliver the news over a telephone. Even more strikingly, by the time these final revelations emerged, Mark Goddard, who had played the rugged pilot Don West, had already died of pulmonary fibrosis on October 10, 2023, at the age of 87. Jonathan Harris, the irreplaceable Dr. Smith, had passed away on November 3, 2002. Bob May, the man who climbed inside the robot suit every single day for 3 years, had died in January 2009. Dick Tufeld, who was the robot's voice, followed in January 2012. And yet, the 3 Robinson children who remain are still finding each other. On March 17, 2026, Bill Mumy posted a photograph of himself standing with Angela Cartwright and Marta Kristen and captioned it, "Judy, Penny, and Will Robinson, spotted on Earth yesterday." 60 years after the show first aired, they are still showing up for one another. That single fact tells you something important about what this show truly was, underneath the foam rubber aliens and the spray-painted props. But here's what nobody outside their circle knew for decades. The cast that survived stayed loyal to each other for 60 years. The man who was supposed to die early ended up controlling the entire show, and he did it so brilliantly that even the people he outmaneuvered eventually admitted it was a masterpiece. Before Jonathan Harris was Dr. Smith, he was a pharmacist's son from a 6-story tenement building in the Bronx who had literally invented himself from scratch. His parents were Russian immigrants. His father worked in Manhattan's garment district. The boy who grew up speaking what he later described as thick Bronx street slang made a decision early in his life that he was going to become someone else entirely. He changed his surname from Cherasukin to Harris at 17, against his father's furious objections. He earned a pharmacy degree he never used, fabricated an acting resume, and talked his way into a career that would eventually include Broadway, The Twilight Zone, and roughly 125 stage productions. When Irwin Allen offered him the role on Lost in Space, Harris looked at the character as written and immediately recognized a career trap. Smith was a cold-blooded spy who killed a guard in the pilot's opening minutes and reprogrammed the robot to kill the Robinson family in their sleep. He was designed to be despicable and eliminated within 5 episodes. Harris understood exactly what this meant. A role that ends in 5 episodes is not a career. It is an expensive dead end. So he started rewriting things, quietly at first. He would arrive on set with entirely new pages of dialogue written overnight. He told the cast, "Let us go over the scene. I have changed all the dialogue." Bill Mumy, still a child at the time, watched this and later described it with genuine awe. Harris would rewrite scenes and then quietly engineer every beat of the action so that all roads led back to Smith. The cowardly eye rolls, the melodramatic wailing about his back, and most importantly, the cascade of invented insults hurled at the robot. None of it appeared in any script. Harris sat up nights constructing phrases like bubble-headed booby, nickel-plated nincompoop, and bellicose bumpkin. He explained his reasoning with perfect logic. The robot was wise to Smith's schemes, and Smith had to attack it constantly to keep it from exposing him. Every insult was a survival tactic dressed as comedy. By the time Irwin Allen understood what had happened, 500 fan letters a month were pouring in for Dr. Smith. Allen had no realistic choice but to celebrate it. He later said openly, "Smith was not originally created as a comedy character, but Jonathan Harris dictated what we should do with the character." Harris negotiated a special guest star credit on every one of all 83 episodes, reportedly the first time that billing structure had appeared on American television. But Allen's public praise concealed a private discomfort, because the actor he had hired to be his leading hero was watching his entire role dissolve in front of him, and there was nothing either of them could do about it anymore. Guy Williams came to Lost in Space as one of the most recognizable men on American television. 4 years as Zorro on Disney had made him a genuine star, and the show's merchandise had generated $11 million within months of its premiere. He was tall, fencing trained since age 7, and genuinely excited about playing John Robinson, the brilliant mission commander who would lead his family through the universe. This was supposed to be his show. The transformation happened gradually enough to feel almost polite. In Season 1, Williams' screen time began shrinking as the Dr. Smith storylines expanded. By Season 2, it was a pattern. By Season 3, it was simply the reality of the production. Williams appeared on set, delivered a handful of lines, and stood in the background while Jonathan Harris, Bill Mumy, and the robot carried the episode forward. Mark Goddard described the atmosphere directly. The show started going more toward the robot and Smith, and there were hard feelings from Guy especially. Jonathan Harris himself acknowledged the damage, which is remarkable given that he was the cause of it. He said openly that Williams was hired to be the star of the piece and ended up with an occasional line every other week. Harris called this very difficult for an actor to endure. He was correct, he just did not stop doing it. Williams filled his idle hours listening to classical music, reading astronomy, playing chess, and buying stocks. Bill Mumy gave him the nickname The Comb because Williams groomed himself constantly between takes, a man turning restless energy into something harmless. In one reported exchange with Harris, Williams erupted with the words, "God damn it, I will kill you, Harris," before adding, after a pause, "I mean Smith." Whether accidental or deliberate, it captured something completely real about the situation. After Cancellation, Williams discovered his Hollywood career had not survived being the background of his own show. Then he found that halfway around the world, his situation was entirely reversed. Zorro had become a cultural institution in Argentina. The government gave him a luxury marina apartment. The wife of President Perón personally invited him to perform at a charity event. He spent the last 21 years of his life living as something close to royalty in a country that had never forgotten what he meant to them. On May 6, 1989, police entered his Buenos Aires apartment after friends reported his disappearance and found him alone. A ruptured brain aneurysm had killed him approximately a week earlier. He was 65. Nobody had known because he had been living alone and mobile phones did not yet exist. The man promised the lead of a television series had died undiscovered a week before anyone found him, in a country that loved him more than his own industry ever had. Bill Mumy later said simply, "When the show ended, he never saw Guy again, not once." The leading man died alone on the other side of the world. Back on the studio lot where the show had been filmed, another cast member had spent 3 years enduring something far more physically dangerous, and the production company had decided it was not a problem worth solving. Every child who watched Lost in Space in the 1960s loved the robot. It waved its accordion arms, barked warnings, and somehow managed to feel warm despite being made entirely of metal and rubber. For 3 years, the person physically inside that machine was suffering in ways the production company had quietly decided were not anyone else's concern. Bob May walked into the Lost in Space audition by accident while applying for a different job at 20th Century Fox. Irwin Allen's team sent him to try on the robot suit. The audition was brutally simple. If you fit, you are hired. When May climbed out of the suit after his first session inside, he was cut and bleeding from the metal edges. He took the job anyway. The suit weighed approximately 90 kilograms. Under studio lights, the interior temperature became what May later described as his own jacuzzi and sauna combined. The costume was nearly airtight. On at least 2 confirmed occasions across the 3 seasons, May passed out inside it from lack of oxygen. His eyes rolled back and he went limp before crew members realized something was wrong. The production company's official response to these incidents was that there was no time to stop filming. May was a devoted smoker who puffed cigarettes inside the costume during breaks between takes. June Lockhart recalled seeing smoke drifting through the robot's seams and finding it quietly amusing. The legend involves Irwin Allen arriving between scenes, spotting smoke rising from the apparently empty robot and panicking that the suit was on fire. When he discovered it was May enjoying a cigarette, Allen reportedly decreed that whenever a script called for the robot to emit smoke, May should personally generate it. Despite performing every physical gesture that made the robot one of television's most beloved characters, Bob May was never credited on screen during the entire original run. Not one episode in all 3 seasons carried his name. The practical consequence was lower pay and significantly reduced residuals. As Lost in Space grew into a global phenomenon, generating licensing income across decades, May and his wife Judith were living in a mobile home park in the San Fernando Valley. In November 2008, the Sayre fire destroyed their home. 2 months later, May died of congestive heart failure at 69. What defined his later years was not bitterness, but extraordinary generosity. He became one of the most beloved figures on the science fiction convention circuit, staying at signing tables until every fan had their moment, no matter how long it took. He said once, "I will stay at any convention signing autographs until the last fan is finished or the cleaning crew forces me to leave." A man made invisible by the industry that profited from him chose to make sure that no fan ever felt invisible in front of him. The robot smiled for 60 years of reruns and never once showed what was happening inside. The show itself worked the same way. Before any of those cameras rolled, Irwin Allen had tried to make something completely different, and the network had buried it before it could breathe. Before there was a robot, before there was a Dr. Smith, before there was a single foam rubber alien or a catchphrase about pain, there was a 60-minute film that Irwin Allen believed was the best work of his career. He was wrong about many things over the years, but on this point, he was probably right. The original Lost in Space pilot, titled No Place to Hide, was filmed in late 1964 on a budget of approximately $600,000 US, which made it the most expensive television pilot ever produced at that time. The cinematographer had won 3 Academy Awards. The special effects supervisor was a future Oscar winner. The writer later contributed scripts to Star Trek. Allen financed it with backing from CBS, 20th Century Fox, Red Skelton, and Groucho Marx. The story was clean and entirely serious. A family called the Robinsons launched toward Alpha Centauri, were knocked off course by a meteor storm, and landed on an alien planet where they had to survive. Both Robinson parents held doctorates. The children were prodigies. There was no villain, no comedy, no robot, no internal conflict. It played like a genuine film. Will Robinson sat around a campfire and sang Greensleeves. It was a survival story about brilliant people facing a frightening situation with intelligence and cooperation. When Allen screened it for CBS executives, he expected professional silence. Instead, they laughed with delight and bought the series immediately. Then, they handed him a list of demands. The pilot was too hardware-driven. They wanted a recurring antagonist who could generate weekly conflict without requiring new threats from scratch. Allen suggested Ming the Merciless. His story editor pushed for something closer to Long John Silver. They settled on Dr. Zachary Smith. CBS also required a robot. The ship was redesigned, and the original Sirius pilot was locked in a storage vault. Approximately 80% of that original footage was eventually cut up and inserted into the first 5 episodes of Season 1. Dr. Smith and the robot were conveniently written as having stayed behind at the ship in each of those episodes, explaining their absence from footage that predated their existence by almost a year. The show premiered on September 15, 1965. 2 important facts rarely mentioned. The Jupiter 2 interior set cost $350,000, making it the most expensive standing television set of its era, more costly than the entire Enterprise bridge on Star Trek. And the theme music was composed by a 24-year-old named Johnny Williams, who later became John Williams and wrote the scores for Star Wars, Jaws, and Indiana Jones. The Sirius vision was replaced with something the network could sell, and for 2 seasons it worked brilliantly. But ratings can hide the truth that only the people on set can see. And behind the cameras, 2 of the most famous science fiction franchises in American history were conducting a war that neither side ever fully admitted to. The rivalry between Lost in Space and Star Trek is one of the most misunderstood stories in television history, because most people assume it was a fair creative contest between 2 equally respected shows. In raw ratings, it was not close. Lost in Space consistently placed between 32nd and 35th in the weekly Nielsen rankings. Star Trek never climbed higher than approximately 52nd during its entire original run. The show remembered today as the pinnacle of 1960s science fiction was losing the ratings war every single week it aired. The rivalry began before either show existed. Gene Roddenberry pitched Star Trek to CBS in a 2-hour meeting. One of the network's executives questioned him closely about his production plans, and the reason for that executive's detailed interest was that CBS was already developing Lost in Space and had no intention of buying a competing science fiction property. CBS said no. Roddenberry took Star Trek to NBC. Both shows then spent 3 seasons competing for the same audience's loyalty without ever occupying the same time slot. The most genuinely funny artifact of this rivalry happened during Season 3, when the Lost in Space makeup team needed to create a pointy-eared alien boy for an episode and found themselves short on both time and budget. Their solution was to borrow the actual molds used to make Spock's ears from the Star Trek production, paint them a different color, and apply them to their own alien character. Devoted Star Trek fans immediately recognized the ears and publicly accused Lost in Space of plagiarism. The actual explanation was entirely mundane. Makeup artists from both productions were close friends who regularly shared resources to survive impossible deadlines. Inside the Jupiter 2, a completely unexpected love story was unfolding. Angela Cartwright was 13 when Lost in Space began filming. Bill Mumy was 10. They went through their entire adolescence together on that set, tutored together at Fox's studio school, eating lunch together, running lines together. Mumy described it later with characteristic directness. "We were each other's first true love." He waited until he was old enough to drive before inviting Cartwright on a proper date, not because anyone required it, but because he wanted the occasion to feel right. They were briefly engaged in the early 1970s before ending the relationship quietly and without bitterness, two young people recognizing they were still becoming themselves. What nobody predicted was what came next. For more than 50 years, they remained genuinely close friends, not politely distant, but actually close. They co-authored multiple books, appeared at conventions together, and as recently as March 2026 were photographed laughing together with Marta Kristen. Then there was Mumy's other secret. While spending his working days fighting alien monsters for Lost in Space, he was going home every evening and watching Star Trek with devoted enthusiasm. He was, in his own words, a committed Trekkie through the entire run of the show that was supposedly Star Trek's rival. Decades later, he made it official by appearing in a Star Trek Deep Space Nine episode where his character, a Starfleet officer named Kellen, dies in combat. The producer reportedly got a considerable kick out of killing Will Robinson. The rivalry dissolved in a detail so strange it sounds invented. Irwin Allen died on November 2, 1991. Gene Roddenberry had died 9 days earlier on October 24th. The two creators, who had spent their careers competing over the same corner of the American imagination, left this world within the same 2-week window. What their show had left behind was still carrying wounds that had never been addressed. The end of Lost in Space is one of the most instructive stories in the history of how television treats the people who make it. The show ran for 83 episodes across 3 seasons. It never received a finale. The Robinson family was never rescued. They never reached Alpha Centauri. They never came home. The last episode filmed ended with the family still stranded on a distant planet, fully believing they were returning in 8 weeks for a season 4 that was never going to happen. The cancellation came down to a negotiation that Irwin Allen refused to lose. CBS offered a 4th season with a 15% budget cut. Allen said no. Jonathan Harris later told this story with a mixture of admiration for Allen's pride and frustration at the consequence. The show was canceled not because audiences stopped watching, but because the producer refused to accept less money. CBS announced the decision on February 19, 1968. June Lockhart read it in her morning newspaper. Marta Kristen received a phone call and described herself as speechless. Bill Mumy cried. No wrap party, no farewell, no handshake from the network. The show had been sending distress signals for months before CBS acted. The episode that stands as the purest symbol of Lost in Space's creative collapse aired during the final season and was called The Great Vegetable Rebellion. In it, Dr. Smith picks a flower on an alien planet and is put on trial by a sentient plant creature, then transformed into a stalk of celery. The central villain was a man in a full-body foam rubber carrot costume. The writer, Peter Packer, arrived at Jonathan Harris's dressing room holding the script behind his back, too embarrassed to hand it over directly. Guy Williams and June Lockhart could not get through their scenes without laughing. Irwin Allen was so furious about their inability to maintain composure that he wrote both of them out of the next 2 episodes, at full salary as punishment for laughing at his own show. The episode became a symbol of collapse. And then it became something stranger. When TV Guide published its list of the 100 greatest television episodes in 1997, The Great Vegetable Rebellion appeared at number 76. The City on the Edge of Forever, widely considered the single greatest hour of Star Trek ever produced, appeared at number 92. The Carrot episode ranked higher than the most celebrated episode in Star Trek history. Television is not a rational medium. What happened to the cast over the following decades tells a more complicated story than the industry prefers to acknowledge. Mark Goddard had been privately warned by Guy Williams that Lost in Space was, in Williams's words, a career buster. Goddard eventually hid his association with the show when he appeared on Broadway, removing the credit from his playbill. He later earned a master's degree in education and became a special education teacher in Massachusetts, working with children who needed him in a way that Nielsen ratings never could measure. Jonathan Harris spent the rest of his career as a prolific voice actor. He voiced Manny in Pixar's A Bug's Life in 1998, appeared in Toy Story 2 the following year, and voiced a character on the animated series Freakazoid that was an explicit Dr. Smith parody, playing a version of himself, playing a version of the character he had perfected over 40 years. When the 1998 Lost in Space film was produced, the studio offered Harris a 6-line cameo. He rejected it with words that immediately became famous in Hollywood circles. They offered me an innocuous 6-line bit they laughingly called a cameo, and I told them exactly where to shove it. He had never played a bit part in his life, and he was not going to start at 83. A reunion film titled Lost in Space: The Journey Home was in development in the early 2000s, with Harris set to star. Then, in November 2002, Harris entered a hospital for a chronic back problem, the same back that Dr. Smith had wailed about in melodramatic agony for 3 seasons and died of a blood clot. He was 3 days short of his 88th birthday. The reunion film died with him. Bill Mumy delivered one of the eulogies. Angela Cartwright wrote that she could still hear exactly the way Harris had said her name. The Netflix reboot that ran from 2018 to 2021 found an elegant way to honor what came before. The rebooted Dr. Smith was given the full name June Harris, combining June Lockhart and Jonathan Harris into a single character name. Bill Mumy appeared in the pilot as a character identified simply as Dr. Z. Smith. Angela Cartwright played Dr. Smith's mother in Season 2, and June Lockhart, at 96 years old, voiced Alpha Control in Season 3, her voice carrying everything you expected from it after 60 years of watching her: intelligence, warmth, and the quiet authority of someone who had been doing this since 1965. She died 2 years later at 100, peacefully in her sleep, having watched the series canceled, revived, mocked, celebrated, rebooted, and preserved across 3 generations of fans. She carried the story of that cold newspaper morning in 1968 not as a wound, but as something she had survived and moved past. That capacity for grace, to endure what the industry did to them and remain generous about it, was the quality the 3 Robinson children who are still alive share most completely. Bill Mumy, Angela Cartwright, and Marta Kristen still find each other. They still show up at conventions and tell stories about Irwin Allen banging his hammer against a bucket and Jonathan Harris arriving on set with 14 pages of new dialogue he had written overnight. They carry the Jupiter 2 with them, not as a burden, but as proof that something genuinely extraordinary happened inside that fiberglass spaceship. The Robinson family never made it home in the story. The people who played them never stopped finding their way back to each other. That is the version of Lost in Space that history forgot to tell, and now you know all of it.